In a few minutes, but just to say that tea and coffee is now available, so do please help yourself. You maybe need to head out into the entrance hall for that. There's food at the back, so do please help yourself, make yourself at home, and we'll begin in a few minutes. Thanks a lot. just extend a very warm welcome to everyone who's made it. We're really glad to see you. We're thankful to everyone who's laid on this food and this tea and coffee. We're really grateful for that. So welcome. And now what we're going to do this evening is in 3 parts. So the main event is Gareth Davies here, who is going to be interviewed by Tony. So that's going to take the bulk of our time. And but before that, I did think that we could watch a short video, which is on YouTube. It's just under 12 minutes long, and it's adapted from the Crown TV series and the episode of The Crown that was focused on the Aberfan disaster. So I don't know who's may have watched that, but it uses that to really tell the story. So I thought it would be good for us to use 12 minutes to do that, just to get a clear picture in our minds about what actually happened. So we'll watch that. Then we'll move straight to this interview between Tony and Gareth. And Gareth was one of the children pulled from that school. And then after that, I'll finish off the evening with a sort of 10-minute talk, just talking about the hope that Gareth's going to speak about. And just tie up the evening in that way. So without any further ado, I think we'll watch this video. So thanks very much.
In 1966, a disaster scarred a village in South Wales. What happened was unthinkable. A coal tip on a mountain slope above the village of Aberfan collapsed, crashing directly into a local school below it. In an instant, much of a village's generation was lost. Many of those who survived were traumatized for the rest of their lives. But what does this tragedy have to do with Queen Elizabeth? That's what episode 3 of The Crown's 3rd season deals with, as we see Queen Elizabeth grapple with what it means to be the stoic figurehead of a nation in the face of unimaginable tragedy. It also shows how the events which followed reportedly became one of the greatest regrets of Queen Elizabeth's reign. In this video, we're going to tell you more about what happened, some of the reasons why, and what happened afterwards. As with everything in The Crown, the episode was meticulously researched, but it is a drama, so some creative license is used to drive the personal stories. Class is a recurring theme in this series of The Crown, but it's never more pertinent than in this episode. So to understand the story behind it, you also need to understand the history of mining towns and villages in South Wales. From the 19th century until the early 20th century, coal mining was crucial to Wales and parts of the north of England. Mines provided jobs, which in turn created pockets of mining communities spreading across areas like the South Wales valleys. By the 1960s, mining was beginning to dwindle due to competition from oil. Yet, coal mining still fueled the community of not just Aberfan, but neighbouring villages too. Think of the mine as the central hub of this village. If no one in your family worked there, someone you knew definitely did. It was dangerous work. But people assumed it was dangerous for miners, not their families. Surrounding these mines were huge tips built from waste produced during the mining process. The tips were known to slip. In fact, there were 3 previous significant tip slides, but none to the extent tip number 7 did in 1966.
I've never seen one this far before.
That tip in particular had concerned the people of Aberfan for years, because it was located almost directly above Pantglas Junior School, the local primary. What's more, it was discovered the coal waste lay on top of a mountain spring, which meant the whole thing was dangerously fluid. At the time, the mines were run by the National Coal Board, a statutory corporation set up by the British government when mines were nationalised in 1947. 3 years before the disaster, a waterworks engineer wrote to the Coal Board about the danger the tip posed. Local councillors also warned of the danger. Parents from Pantglas School signed a petition. They were ignored.
We've been telling everyone for years those tips were dangerous.
Here's what happened that day. For weeks beforehand, the Merthyr Valley had been hit by a torrential downpour. turning the tip to slurry. Workers arrived in the morning to find it had sunk dangerously by about 10 feet. There were no phone lines working up there that day, so workers hurried their way down the mountain to warn bosses of the danger.
Something's not right. What do you mean? We should get a safety team up there now.
But it was too late.
Someone needs to check it out. Be quiet.
The tip began to fall at approximately 9:15 a.m. Just as children had sat down on the morning of what was the last day before half-term. If the tip had fallen just 20 minutes earlier, the story may well have been entirely different. The teachers had just begun taking their attendance when the landslide hit. An avalanche of liquefied slurry tore down the mountain, reaching speeds of 30 to 40 miles per hour. Survivors who were inside the school described hearing a thunderous noise, like a jet plane, as the avalanche approached. As had long been feared by those who had warned the National Coal Board, the mud crashed directly into the school and many of the neighbouring houses. It happened so quickly, there was barely time to react. As soon as news of the tragedy spread, people from across South Wales arrived in Aberfan to help. Miners found themselves digging for their own children. Initially, they worried about bringing in mechanical diggers, fearing their weight would crush anyone trapped underneath, so many began digging with their bare hands. Whenever anyone in the rescue effort thought they heard someone buried under the heap of dirt, a whistle was blown, stopping everyone in their tracks.
Quiet! Quiet! Quiet!
While some children were pulled out alive, the rescue effort was unimaginably difficult due to the sheer amount of hardened slurry. In the end, 116 children and 28 adults were found dead, and it took a week to find them all because there was so much to dig through. As shown in the episode, the local chapel became a makeshift mortuary. In the show, Queen Elizabeth eventually visits Aberfan following the threat of criticism from the press.
The very last thing emergency and rescue services need when they're working against the clock is a Queen turning up.
In real life, it did indeed take the Queen 8 days to visit Aberfan. Later, in 2002, it was reported the Queen said her biggest regret was not visiting Aberfan immediately after the disaster. Buckingham Palace has never confirmed nor denied this, but the Queen, out of all the royals, has returned to Aberfan the most. What you don't see in the episode is what happened later. PTSD was common in those children who did survive the disaster, many of them suffering from survivor's guilt, as they attempted to come to terms both with the death of their friends and with their own personal trauma. Miners, too, felt overwhelming guilt, as did parents who wished they'd stopped their children from going to school that day. Bereaved parents struggled with even seeing other children out in the streets. The entire village was in mourning. The children who died became known as Aberfan's lost generation. We see a taste of their grief and anger towards the National Coal Board in the episode.
Will you both accept responsibility?
This anger spilled into the official inquest into the deaths. One father shouted,
Buried alive by the National Coal Board. That's what I want to see written on my child's desk.
Another person who didn't go to the site of the disaster immediately was the chairman of the National Coal Board, Lord Robbins, preferring instead to continue with a ceremony installing him as the Chancellor of the University of Surrey. The day after his eventual visit, he was interviewed by a television news team, claiming no one from the board knew there was a spring underneath the tip. The NCB resisted taking the blame, claiming the disaster was down to the heavy rain and other geological factors.
National Coal Board cannot accept responsibility for the weather.
Ultimately, a tribunal placed the blame for the disaster entirely with the NCB, criticising a complete lack of policy when it came to dealing with the tips. It was the largest tribunal in British history, with around 130 witnesses. Yet, no one was prosecuted, and no one from the board lost their job as a result. Lord Robbins publicly offered his resignation,
but I felt the circumstances were such that my resignation should be offered, and therefore it's really a matter for the government to decide whether they accept my resignation.
But papers released decades later revealed he had only done so when he was assured his job was safe. Not only did he remain in his post, he was appointed to chair a committee which made recommendations about health and safety regulations. In the years since the disaster, it also emerged how badly the victims' families were treated as the NCB attempted to dodge responsibility. A study from 2000 found the board and the government of the day were extremely insensitive to the victims' families. Dr. Ian McLean, one of the authors of the report, said victims' families were treated as troublemakers. And there was further hurt still for those families. A disaster fund set up by the mayor of Merthyr Tydfil had drawn donations from all over the world, with a final total of around 1.75 million. As legal battles over the fund continued, residents from the village had begun a campaign to remove the tips surrounding Aberfan, fearing they could collapse once again. But the NCB refused to take financial responsibility for the removal of the tips. In the end, the government took $150,000 from the fund to make up the funds needed to get rid of the tips. It was yet another blow to the community, described by the press as the second disaster to befall Aberfan. That money was only repaid in 1997, but without accounting for inflation. With inflation, that amount would have been over £1 million. The Crown's writer, Peter Morgan, said he had always planned to cover Aberfan in the series. The team behind the show worked with the people of the village to ensure the story was told with sensitivity, as well as to bring the history to a wider, global audience. The community was involved from the very beginning. Some people, who were relatives or neighbours of those who died in Aberfan, appeared as extras in some scenes. Ynys Owen Male Voice Choir, which was set up after the disaster, sings in the episode. The team decided not to film in Aberfan itself, choosing nearby Cwmaman instead. An empty school there became Pantglas, while the towering tip was recreated in CGI. A rain machine recreated the torrential downpour which fell on the valleys in the days leading up to the disaster. More than 50 years on, the trauma following the disaster still remains, as producers found when they held a public meeting with people from the village. Everyone at that meeting, on set, and at the subsequent screening of the episode held in Aberfan, were offered therapy. It's important to remember the deep trauma Aberfan caused not just to the area, but to Wales as a whole, as it became a symbol of corporate negligence towards the working classes. Today, Aberfan is a very different place to the village we see in The Crown. The Merthyr Vale colliery closed in 1989, as have most of the mines in South Wales, and the tips are long gone. The school has been replaced by a memorial garden. But the village has never forgotten what happened there 53 years ago.
Well, sobering things. I'm going to invite Tony and Gareth now to come and to hear the story. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, welcome, everyone. It's a privilege to welcome Gareth Davies with us this evening. Gareth, welcome to Grangetown Baptist Church. This is my home church, and privileged that Ian has arranged this for us. And it's lovely to have some visitors with us here tonight as well.
I do feel like we're something like a failed Take That tribute act at the moment. What's our opening number?
You don't want to start that. That's a bad idea. Listening to that, personally, a lot of people here have got children. I find it quite emotional. And you're very familiar with the story, but nevertheless, it's quite something. I just want to put into context for everyone. So you were there, right?
Yeah.
As Max Boyce would say, you were there. And we'll touch on that. And I want to touch on it in a couple of ways, really. You are a Christian now.
Yes.
And you became a Christian later on in life. And I want to touch on it in a couple of ways which look at why would you be interested in God? And so I want to go through the events, not just Aberfan, but events which may well be connected in some way to what happened there later on in your life. And in the sense of, well, given those events, why would you be interested in God? And then following on from that, looking at your reaction to some of those events, and then the question, why would God be interested in you, given some of your reactions to those events? And then you can, hopefully that'll cover your story, and hopefully we'll get to a place where we find out how you moved on with your relationship with God, if you like. So it's quite interesting, really interesting. So age-wise, I'm guessing you were born 61?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, so let's just put it out there, a bit older than me. Let's just put that straight out there. Only a tiny bit, though. So you were and tomorrow, of course, is the 56th anniversary, isn't it, I think?
That's right, yeah.
Of the disaster in Aberfan. So you were 5 at the time?
Yeah, I was 5. I'd started school in the September, and this happened in the October, just the day before half term.
And I'm guessing, as a 5-year-old, I can't remember a thing from when I was 5. The idea of getting crystal memories that you can rely on is probably a bit tough.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm often asked what my memories are of the day, and I say that all I have is sort of a number of snapshots. I don't have sort of moving pictures like those.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, that's like me of yesterday, quite frankly, but that's the way it goes. In terms of your mum and dad, then, tell us a bit about. So, what were they involved in the mines? What were they doing?
Yeah, my dad was a miner.
Right.
My dad worked in Merthville Colliery. My mum was a nurse.
Yep.
But at the time, she was looking after us as kids, so she was working in the local shop. So right in the heart of the community. Yeah.
And I understand you didn't speak about these events to your mum or your family for 50 years after they occurred, right?
It was the 50th anniversary of the disaster, 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And my mother was staying with us down in Pembrokeshire.
Yeah.
Having a breakdown with us. And there was so much on television at the time.
Yeah.
I remember I recorded it all and then didn't watch it. But Mum was with us, and I remember asking her what was her experience of that day. And that was the first conversation I'd had with anybody, any member of my family about Aberfan. Why do you think that's the case? I never had thought about it. It was just our normal.
Yeah.
Excuse me. It was just our normal. Nobody spoke about it. It wasn't just me being weird or my family being weird. Nobody from Aberfan spoke about Aberfan. It just wasn't discussed. Funny, you hear in that now that everybody in the Crown's recreation was offered counselling after that recreation.
Yeah.
Well, nobody had counselling after Aberfan itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and even sitting here, I think I can't let my mind go into what must have gone through the parents' minds on that day. I daren't go there.
I wish I hadn't asked the question.
Yeah.
I'll tell you her answer if you like.
Yeah, go for it.
She was surprised that I asked the question because we hadn't spoken about it for 50 years, and then she gave me the mother's perspective of walking up the street, and there were a number of bodies laying out under blankets, and the mothers were approaching the bodies and lifting the corner of the blanket and feeling the relief of knowing that it wasn't your child, but knowing that 2 or 3 behind you in the queue was that child's mother. I wish I hadn't asked the question.
So I'm wondering, there were lots of effects. Kind of, we heard some of the effects on, the funding, all that sort of stuff. But then there were lots. I understand a lot of people, so a lot of children were lost, and of those who survived, a lot of their parents left fairly soon afterwards. Is that right?
Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
114 children, I think it was, were lost, died on that day, and then a lot of families decided they didn't want to be in Aberfan anymore for very clear and obvious reasons.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
And on top of that, all the tension among the community, because there was this issue of, should you accept blood money, as compensation? And of course you had miners dads working in the mines, some of which had lost children, some of which hadn't.
Yeah.
And the sorts of things that does in a community in close proximity.
It's worse than that, because the stuff that came down the mountain was dug out by those very miners.
Yeah.
So they actually owned the responsibility for creating that rubble.
Yeah.
And some of them worked as the people who took the drams up and tipped it there.
Yeah.
So they had this direct responsibility for killing not only their own children or their colleagues' children, or that's how they felt about it. But for those of us left, I don't remember it at the time, but my mother told me long afterwards, after we had that conversation, that she didn't let us go out and play in the streets because we would be loud playing outside the houses of people who had lost their children. So there was that impingement on childhood, if you like, as well, which I wasn't aware of at the time.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, it's probably impossible for you to say, but do you think it affected the parenting in any other way, or the way you grew up in any other way?
I've talked about my life now a number of times at events such as this, and what I try to communicate is that my life that I'll tell you about is my normal.
Yeah.
I can't answer questions of whether it was anybody else's normal. To me, this was my normal. It's only afterwards that you look at your life through new eyes that you begin to question what it was you used to do.
Yeah. And you obviously you got on with an education somehow, and the other children in Aberfan picked things up, families picked things up and got on, because you went through school, you got into Aberystwyth University.
Yes.
You were a swimmer.
I was.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about, obviously you had a childhood which existed around sport. You were quite a competitive, keen swimmer, and you must have got on with your studies.
Yes and no.
Right.
Actually, on the site of the school, using the funds that were raised, they built a community centre which included a swimming pool.
Okay.
And that was then 50 yards from my house, because my house was right in front of the school. So I started going swimming and found I was good at it and committed myself to it and trained very hard to become a competitive swimmer. So yes to that. Studied, no. I hated school. I sort of muddled through, but just about got there. Yeah.
And on the swimming front, was there any connection between your effort putting into that as a way of justifying and saying, look, I am here and I've got something, and I'm not here just because I survived. I want to do something myself.
I don't know, but what I do look back on and I wonder is whether I chose swimming as an occupation, as a hobby, because it meant you didn't have to spend time with anybody else. Right. I'd spend 2 hours a day with my face in water. Yeah. You don't have to talk to anybody else then. Yeah. Because I don't remember having friends in Aberfan.
Right. So, and that as a young child growing up in that situation is a difficult situation. Yeah. So you got to Aberystwyth.
I did.
How did you do at Aber?
It was a bit of a false start in that, look, I never wanted, you're probably gathering, I never wanted to live in Aberfan. I didn't want to be in Aberfan. I'd wished that my family had been one of the families that had left immediately afterwards. I just didn't like the place. And to me, going to college was my escape plan. And the day I got there was a great day for me, because that was my plan enacted. I was away.
You're away from the Aberfan environment. You're not one of those that survived. You're just a student, on with the show.
And my independent life began. More than student, it was my independent life. As far as I was concerned, I'd left home that day.
That was it,
but things didn't go to plan.
Right.
Because my parents dropped me off on the corner of the pier, if anybody knows Aberystwyth. Dropped me off there, and I pushed them in the car and off they went. Yeah. But they had a car crash on the way home. And just near Brecon, they hit a stock lorry coming the other way, and my father was killed.
Goodness me.
Yeah.
Goodness me. So, we'll deal with how you dealt with that in a few moments' time. But that, again, is, quite something in terms of a young boy's life. You had, in your earlier life, regarded yourself as an atheist. At that time, were you thinking about God at all? Did you ask yourself, why is this happening to me? What's going on? Was it, or was it just, how did you deal with it, but what was the logic process in your mind?
I don't ever remember thinking about God. I don't ever remember shaking my fist at God or anything of that nature. He wasn't, consciously, he wasn't part of my life, and never had been. I had a good upbringing. I had loving parents. They were very caring and all the rest of it, but we didn't go to church or chapel as a family. So I didn't really have a relationship with any God.
So you just took the events as they came, if you like.
Yeah.
And that isn't the last of the events, because you ended up getting romantically involved.
Yeah, I got married.
You got married.
Yeah.
Sounds like from your point of view, again, I can start leading a normal life now.
Oh yeah, this was building a life, building a family of my
Found
own.
a woman I love.
Yeah.
Had a child.
Yeah, had a child very quickly.
And the child survives. Let's get that straight out there.
Yeah, happy ending.
Which is great.
Yeah.
But there's a complication there, which you found out fairly soon. And was this just after Aberystwyth now?
Yeah, I was about 23, so this was about 18 months after leaving Aberystwyth. I got married, had a child very quickly, had a son, and as a typical new parent, you invest all of your emotion and everything in that.
Absolutely, and you would die for this child.
Yeah, absolutely. And then found out that he wasn't my son, that my wife had an affair very early on in our marriage, and the son was another man's.
Wow. I mean, so you must be, something must be in you going on in you at this point. Hold on, I grew up without any friends because they'd all died. My dad died when I went to university. I got married, I thought this was it. Oh my goodness, that marriage was then wrecked.
Oh yeah, that marriage was over, and I know I said that this is my normal, this was my reality, but even then I began thinking, hang on, is this normal? But it was another kick.
Yeah, and when you look back at that relationship, is there anything you can focus on and you think, well, it wasn't right, and now I look back on it, I can tell that, or not? Or was it just complete out of the blue?
Yeah, the power of hindsight is a wonderful thing, and I'm sure everyone here would agree. And that marriage was a mistake, but at the time, I was building a family, and I was, delighted about it. So yeah.
How long before you found somebody else?
I got married again.
Yep.
Had girlfriends and what have you in the interim, but I got married again. That would have been, I don't know, I think probably about 10 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And you got married. Again, fantastic. At last, finally settled down. Normal life.
Yeah, very normal life. We were known, myself and my second wife Jo. We were known as being this really together couple. We spent all of our time together. I have a friend in the room today who knows this story. We were very, very close. Yeah.
But you're not married to Jo now, are you?
No, I didn't realize she was also very close to another man. She also had an affair, and that marriage ended too.
Gareth, goodness me. So there you are. You're what, just kind of mid-30s at this age?
Yeah.
You've had that traumatic upbringing, disaster of losing your father in a shocking way, first marriage, second marriage. What happened after that?
We missed a step, really, an interesting one. I'd set up a business in the meantime. And that was going extremely well.
And this was the financial services business.
Yeah, it was a weird little business. We were writing wills. I'm not going to ask the question, do you have a will? But I'm not doing them anymore. We had an office on Lower Cathedral Road, just up there, and we were writing wills across the country, and it was flying, and we had a number of people out with company cars and secretary typing these things up, and it was
the
really
biggest
growing.
company of its type in the UK. I understand.
We were the biggest independent will writer in the UK.
Yeah, that's
after
quite something.
just 3 years.
Yeah.
And it was flying, and we were having a ball, and I think I was 29 or 30, and I was managing director of it, and it was terrific, and it was great fun. And then there was a change in the law, the Financial Services Act, which we still have enacted today, all about regulated products and what you're allowed to sell. Our route to market, the way in which we sold our wills, meant we used regulated salesmen, but our product wasn't regulated, and therefore they could no longer sell it under the new act. So the day that act came in, our business closed that day.
So overnight, you went from the biggest company doing it to it's illegal for you to do it now.
We sold it for £1.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah.
Well. So what did you do after that? I mean, what was, in the sense of what did you go on to? Because that was your skill set, wasn't it, really?
Oh, myself and my then business partner, we tried a number of other things. We set up a couple of other businesses. We succeeded a little bit. We failed a little bit. And we muddled on.
Yeah.
So kept trying for a number of years.
Yeah.
But eventually I tired of it and felt like I needed a real job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've married a third time?
Yes. After I'd found a new career and began doing reasonably well in that, I met Vanessa, my third wife, my third and final wife.
Yeah.
And again, spoiler alert, we're still together and it's a happy ending.
Yes.
Met Vanessa. I should say re-met Vanessa because she was actually my girlfriend when I was 20, briefly. She's from Troyderoo, the next village up from Aberfan.
Yeah.
And we went to the same school and we'd been out with each other a few times then.
Yeah. And you were one of the 7 people who used Friends Reunited, weren't you?
We met again on Friends Reunited. A forerunner, there's some laughs over there, you were on there, weren't you? A forerunner of Facebook. And, it seemed a great idea at the time, but I went on there, and the only people who sort of made contact were people I'd never spoken to in school.
Yeah. Usual thing. Yeah.
But went back on one day after many months, and there was a message there from Vanessa.
Wow.
And the message was, if this is the Gareth Davies who used to have a yellow Ford Capri, hello, this is Vanessa. It was me.
It was you, okay.
It was me.
You didn't just think, well, I've never had a Capri, but I'll go for it anyway. Let's see what happens.
Great cars, yeah. And we got together, and we still are.
Yeah. So you might look at that, and people might look at the events of your life. You grew up with most of your school friends having been killed, in an awful disaster. You then managed to get over that somehow through sport and other things, and then your dad died at a time when you thought you were getting on with your life. And then you had those remarkable experiences in 2 marriages where you were utterly, utterly betrayed in the deepest possible way. Your business, which seemed to be absolutely thriving, was literally closed overnight and became worthless. And you might look at that and think, well, why would a God do that to me? Let's think about your spiritual journey, if you like, as you thought about God, as you thought about Christ. Where did those things fit into that thinking?
But now or then?
Well, then I'm guessing there wasn't much, was there? Because you were saying you've identified yourself previously as an atheist.
Yeah.
So again, you probably thought, well, it's irrelevant to ask that question. But then when you started to think, what prompted you to, if you like, move, before we look at your reaction to those events, what prompted you to move, having gone through all that, to think, well, okay, there must be a God because bad things have happened to me all the way through my life.
Okay, right, yeah. That wasn't a conscious effort on my part.
Right.
That was something that very much happened to me.
Okay.
I had made the decision that there wasn't a God.
Yeah.
Atheism is an interesting thing. It is actually a belief system. You believe there is no God.
Yeah.
It's not like agnosticism where you're kind of sitting on a fence and hoping. I'd made the decision, to go the full hog.
It's an act of faith in and of itself, isn't it?
It is.
Really? Yeah.
It is, absolutely, yeah. But it's very much a belief in yourself.
Yeah.
But no, Vanessa and I, say we're still together, we're still very happy. But we'd been together for a few years, and she had a cancer scare. And she was going to hospital, and several tiers of checkups and tests and one thing and another. And she came back to Cardiff for, I think it was about the 4th set of results. And they'd booked an appointment to see a surgeon that afternoon. So they kind of said, what they were thinking the results were. And when she got the results, they were all clear. And the doctors were really quite confounded, they were sort of checking both sides of the paper and, what's going on. And Ness came home and said to me that she felt on that day that she'd almost had a hand put on her shoulder and she'd been turned around. And that she had grown up in a family believing there was a God but wasn't a Christian. And I didn't understand that at the time, but hey, go with it. And she came back and she said, I'm going to start going to church. That she felt, obviously, that God had a hand in this. Yeah. So I said, well, hey, delighted for you, really happy for you, atheist, off you go. And she went to church. She asked me then to go and meet her new friends after a few months. She came home talking about her friends that she'd met there very often. So I went along, and I heard my first ever sermon, and I went again for another, I can't remember what it was for.
And this was this Ian Middlemist then?
This was Ian Middlemist. My first ever sermon was Ian.
What a guy, what a guy.
Yeah, starting at the bottom, and it was great. I remember going up to Ian afterwards and saying that was really great. That was a really great story. Yeah. And actually saying, it was all made up, but it was a really great story. I was that arrogant about it. Yeah. But I went back a number of times when she asked me to go to special services and things, and I remember very clearly her asking me then one day to go to a barbecue. The chapel were having a barbecue, and there were some Americans over from Mississippi, and they were having a barbecue. So I went, and it was at that barbecue that the leader of the mission there, Dennis, told a story, and he told the story of the Bible from start to finish in about 20, 25 minutes or something. Okay. And I was gripped. This was a fascinating story that I had never heard. Yeah, I'd never heard the story of the Bible. Obviously, he'd heard bits and bobs as you go through life. But I likened it to I'd never seen Star Wars, but I'd seen bits and pieces. It was the same thing for me. Yeah. And I remember saying a similar thing to Dennis, that that was a cracking story, but all made up. And he said, well, come along tomorrow night, and I'm telling the story of how the Bible was written. And I thought, this will be great. I'm a structured thinker.
I'll pick holes in this. I'll find the...
That's exactly it. I'll pick holes in this. I'll have a good old laugh at everybody. And I went along, and he did the full PowerPoint presentation. It was fascinating.
Because you've got this attitude which has gone through all the events, which is, I'm going to beat this. Yeah, I'm going to overcome this, and I'm going to...
I always have.
Yeah.
I always have. I've always bounced back.
That seems to exactly. You've taken it, and you've beaten it, and you've carried on.
Yeah.
And so exactly, somebody's confronting you with things that imply that your atheism is erroneous in some way. I'm going to beat this. I'm going to confront it.
I believe that I could talk these fools out of it.
Yeah, typical insurance salesman.
Typical insurance salesman. I believed I could talk people out of it. I didn't do wrong. Okay, things happened to me, but I didn't do wrong. I'd bounce back. I'd be strong. I'd do something new, and I'd excel again. And that was my that was my attitude of me.
And it's good that it's interesting that you've developed that kind of resilience, because you could have gone in a different direction, and there were some indications along the way that you were going in a different direction.
Many times.
Yeah. So and let's go through some of those things. So let's the traumatic way in which things started at Aber. How did you react to that?
I got drunk.
You got drunk, right?
I got drunk. I hadn't been drunk before. We've said I was a competitive swimmer at a senior level. I didn't drink. So I got drunk for the first time. But I got very drunk. For 4 years.
You stayed drunk. Yeah.
The way I describe it, looking back on it now, is I was a drunk. That I was always drunk.
Yeah. Do you think that was it your way of coping? Was it just you'd got addicted? Was it a combination of those things?
It was my reality again. So at the time, I wasn't thinking anything of it. It was what I did. Looking back on it now, gosh, yes.
Because just like the swimming, when you're drunk, the real you doesn't have to meet people and talk to people.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like the alter you, which is there, and you're kind of inebriated somewhere inside.
Yeah, and there were always people going out, and I'd always be with them, and
They would go out once a week, but you'd go with everyone on different
people each
nights.
night.
And yeah,
Very much.
That's fascinating.
Very much.
Yeah, and drink was a recurring theme.
Yeah, I fell back on drink a number of times thereafter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And did it ever go further than drink?
It did.
Tell us about that.
I use drugs an awful lot.
Nice.
You know, this isn't like something out of Train Spotting or something.
Yeah.
You know, I wasn't sort of, you know, injecting or anything of this nature. But I smoked cannabis an awful lot for many, many years.
What and the switch from drugs to from alcohol to drugs to alcohol, what was the kind of break in between? What was that all about?
I don't know, to be honest with you. I think a big part of it is opportunity.
Yep.
But I also think a big part of it is that if you drink, you get a hangover. And if you get a hangover, you can't function particularly well. And I had a pretty good career going.
Yeah. Because you're quite a high performer, generally speaking, aren't you?
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I had a career going. I was doing pretty well in the career, and you can't turn up smelling of booze and drunk and hungover. But you don't get that with drugs.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So how did you squeeze out of those? Because those things, they can grip you in a certain way, can't they? How did you squeeze out of those things? You're not a drunk now, I'm guessing.
No, I'm not.
No.
Do you know when the first time I got drunk, Aberystwyth, is probably my worst experience of being drunk. And I snapped out of that because I got a job. I got a job offer as a school teacher, and I sobered up immediately.
Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah.
You know, when I
so again, it's interesting because you mastered it. You were a drunk. You were addicted to alcohol.
Yeah.
But you dominated it, and you beat it.
Never thought of it that way.
Yeah. It's really interesting.
It was. Look, if you drink heavily and constantly for 4 years, the outcome isn't usually getting a good job.
Yeah.
You know, the outcome is usually crime or hospitalization or
exactly.
worse.
Yeah.
But not for me, I guess.
Yeah.
I got a job. I got a job as a school teacher.
Yeah, remarkably for a drunk.
Yeah.
That's quite something. And the drugs then, how did you, because again, even the things you're talking about are quite addictive.
They are quite addictive, and looking back on them, I mean, at the time, it simply wasn't a problem to me.
Yeah.
I realized, or I began to realize at the time, that I was using it as an excuse for not going out and mixing with people and not kind of taking responsibility. But
there you are again. You know, I'm not going to, professionally, it's not my personality, it's my job. Socially, I don't want to know, I'm going to get high, so we're not really, you know, it's me hiding again.
Yeah, although high is a bit of a misnomer when it comes to cannabis.
Yeah,
it's very often low.
Or yo, or whatever. Yeah.
But you know, it was something which at the time was my normal. It was something that I would smoke every night. I would get up and go to work the next day, and I would perform well and go to the gym, and you know, all the stuff that normal people do. But I would then get home and smoke drugs.
Yeah.
But eventually I did.
Stop?
Eventually I recognised it was killing me because you're smoking. It wasn't the drugs so much; it was the smoking, and I stopped.
You stopped. How quickly did you stop?
Well, it's weird. I stopped at 6 o'clock on Sunday, the 6th of June, 2005. I stopped a year early. I should have smoked for another year. It would have been so good, wouldn't it? But I actually stopped at 6 o'clock on that day, and I remember it very clearly. And I smoked my last joint.
My goodness. And this is you again, isn't it? I have now decided I am going to move on from that, and it has no more a grip on me.
This is fascinating. I've never looked at it this way.
It's quite interesting.
Yeah.
So you've got quite this power of will over yourself when you set your mind to something. So I'm interested how these things have kind of drawn together into your experience with God now. Because on the one hand, the things that happened to you could well have pushed you in a very different direction.
Yeah.
You know, you could have been a suicidal drunk who didn't achieve anything in life. And people could have understood that, given your experiences and the terrible things that, and twice, the love of your life ripping your heart out. My goodness, after everything else.
You're making me feel quite sad.
No, I know. Let's not stay there. But no, but you can see how a reaction could take you in a very different direction.
Yeah.
But there were things in your life, the teaching job and other things which were quite remarkable, your own tenacity and ability to overcome those things. And then, it took you in a spiritual direction through Vanessa, which again was a remarkable situation placed in your life. You received an email which you ought not to have received necessarily, but you did, and you followed it up. And again, that was, you might call it providential, you know? And then looking at your own Christian experience then. So you'd come from a position, you're an atheist, a drunk, a drug addict, a divorcee several times, all things which you might think are not the typical story of a middle-class Christian, which some might identify you as now, yeah? So how did all those things draw together in your heart and mind and your relationship through Christ with God?
Well, let's go back to the day of that PowerPoint presentation, because that's where it began to change for me, because I heard this story of how the Bible was written, and it rocked me. Because the story of how it was written is so fantastic, and it is so it is so much something that couldn't be created or made up, that it began to make me doubt my own logic around my decision to become an atheist. Or that I was.
And this
atheist.
is 66 books written over 1,500 years by 40-odd characters, yet holding itself.
It's like us in this room decide to write the book, but we're never going to meet, and we're never going to correspond with each other, and we're each going to live over, you started it at the time the Romans were leaving Britain, and you're going to finish it today, but you're never, ever going to speak to each other, and it created one flawless story that ever since it was published, scholars have tried to find holes in, and nobody has yet found out. And there's me, sitting in a room in Pennuel, in Roach, thinking, I can find holes in it. And thinking, oh, actually, probably.
You've met a challenge that you can't overcome.
And it defeated me.
And it defeated me.
So that's where it began to change for me. But in answering your question of how all of that came together, again, saying now with fresh eyes, new eyes, looking back on my life, I don't look at it as me being resilient or me being great, so great that I can get through this and I can carry on and I'll set something else up and I'll succeed again. I don't look at it that way. I look at it and say that every time something like this happened to me, I made the worst possible decision. My reaction was the worst possible reaction. Alcohol, drugs, isolation. They were the worst possible decisions I can make. The way I look at it now is that I was rescued from each of those. I was rescued from the circumstances, and I was rescued from my decisions and reactions to those circumstances.
So you would call yourself a Christian now?
I do.
So what would be the difference between somebody who calls themselves a Christian and somebody who says, I believe the Bible's true, broadly speaking?
It's like somebody reading a history book and believing that a history book is true. Well, great, that's factual. Indeed, the Bible is a history book, and you can read it and say it is full of true stories. But if that's where it stops, you're missing the point of the Bible, because the Bible is a truth about me. It's a truth about me, about who I was, about who I can be, and about the fact that I can't do anything about it myself. That truth can only be real for me through the work of somebody else. And if you miss that when you read the Bible, start again. Start again.
So this is Christ. You realized, look, actually, I can't do anything. Again, here's another obstacle. Throughout the things I've done in my life, the choices I've made, here's another challenge that Gareth can't defeat. I can't achieve peace with God on my own. Somebody else needs to do it. And you recognized Christ as the one that could do that.
Yeah, it even was recognizing Jesus before understanding peace with God.
Yep.
I recognized, looking back on my life, that I'd made all these mistakes, all these bad decisions, that I'd taken credit for them all. And then I understood that actually I had no credit in it, that Jesus had all the credit in it, that I'd been saved by him, rescued by him time and time again, and that he had a purpose for me.
And then having had all those false starts at being born again yourself through your own efforts, suddenly you were born again through Christ.
Yeah.
Tell us
Again,
a bit,
I never thought about it that way
tell
either.
us about
This
that.
guy's good, isn't he?
Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, it's like all new iterations of me, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, I tried that career, I'll try this one. And fascinating. And I'm still doing that to a degree. I'm living a different life now.
You are, because you're not hiding from us. You're going around the country and everywhere you can get to tell people you're sober, you're not drunk, you haven't got your head in a pool, you're normal, and you're telling people.
Yeah.
And this is the new you, which is absolutely amazing.
It is, but it's that point again about the relationship with God. Yeah. I only realized that what had happened to me, that I was saved. I realized I was saved. I understood that from what I was reading, from what I was hearing, from the words we were singing in hymns. I recognized that I'd been saved. I was baptized, and I recognized that I was born again. Yeah. I do remember the first time one of my old friends, many, many years ago, told me he'd become a born-again Christian. Yeah. And I remember physically going, oh. But I'm a born-again Christian. Hey, hi. But I recognize that now.
Yeah.
But it takes a while to realize that that's because I needed a relationship with God. Yeah. And that was the only way I was going to get it. Yeah. And then to realize why... That God can only accept somebody who's free of sin. Yeah. And I think we can probably agree that I'm not.
Yeah. None of us are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But it was Christ that gave me that ability to be seen as free of sin in God's eyes, and therefore give me the relationship with him. And this all sounds fantastic, doesn't it? You know, fantastic in a fiction sense. It all sounds a fantastic story. But actually it's a fantastic story because it's a true story. And when that hits you, you then are born again. You're giving a new, fresh start. But it's a conscious fresh start. I wouldn't say that any of my previous fresh starts have been conscious fresh starts.
Okay, that's good.
This is a pretty conscious one.
Right, but it's the beginning of the story, I would say. Yeah. Because so now we've got this exuberant, passionate guy who can defeat anything, who is now converted and there for the Lord to work and to use in many ways. You haven't got the burden of a job anymore that you've got to do 60, 70 hours a week. What are you doing with your life now?
I have the burden of a job. I did actually retire some years ago. Yeah. I retired. I'd had enough. I was traveling up and down to London every week. It was very punishing, and I just thought, you know what, that's enough. And I stopped working. And then Vanessa came home one day with one of the free newspapers you pick up in shops. And she said, oh, look at this guy. There's an advert here for a job, a little part-time job running this local charity. You could do that. I said, yeah, I'm sure I could, but I'm retired. But I looked at the ad, and it just grabbed me. It just grabbed me by the heart. And I'll tell a little story. If you apply for jobs, they've got these essential criteria, haven't they? And there was 3 essential criteria: that you had to be from a farming background, which I'm not, that you had to have worked for a charity or in the not-for-profit sector, which I haven't, and that you're fluent in Welsh, which I'm not.
But you thought,
so
I can beat this. I can beat this.
So I applied for it and I got the job, running this little part-time charity, which is now a 60, 70-hour-a-week job running a nationwide charity. 60,
70 part-time?
It is now full-time, yeah. So I am working again, but here's the difference. Yeah. I'm now not working for money. Well, I mean, they do pay me a bit, but it's a charity, so it's not that much. Yeah. But that's not the reason I do the job. I really feel that this is a mission. This is my thing that I should be doing. It's a charity. It's helping farmers who are in crisis, and there's a lot of farmers in a lot of crisis. And I now run that. Unbelievably, I run it. I have no idea how I run it because I have no experience that I think is relevant to run it. But I run it. And I feel that I'm running it not because I want to bring home the paycheck at the end, but because this is something I should be doing.
Yeah, and that's the wonderful end of this story. That throughout all that tragedy and disaster, there's this Jeremiah 29:11 thing going on. I haven't got a Bible. Anyone got Jeremiah 29:11? The idea that God has said, I have a plan for you. Yeah. I have a purpose for you, which is not for bad, but it is for good. Yeah. And you think, it's wonderful how it took its time, but he's brought you to that place.
Do you know, I wish you'd just write it out and put it in a contract and put it on the table for me. It would be so much easier because you'd know where you're going. Wouldn't you know? You'd know where you're going with it. But I have no idea where I'm going with it. Yeah. But I think about more, here I am, send me.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Sorry, it's you know, this means a lot.
It is wonderful, it is
But wonderful. I just think, here I am, send me, and I don't know where I'm going with it.
And you don't know, but you're willing, and here you are, and you want to be used. And that again is the trust in God that motivates any real Christian. You think, I trust you to make the decisions for me. Yeah. I'll try, and I'll get involved, but actually it's all over to you in the end, and I trust you for whatever.
Let's be honest, if I'm going to make the decisions, it's not going to go well.
No, but even then, as that hymn says, you'll praise him for all that is past and trust him for all that's to come. Yeah. And that's wonderful. Hallelujah. Yeah. Gareth, what a privilege to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for telling me who I was.
Do you want to take a seat? Now, I appreciate that there's a limit even to the concentration span of people from Grangetown, so I'm not going to keep you long, but really following on from that, I wanted to take a few minutes to broaden it out a little bit and to talk about how Gareth's experience and his experience with God is not just for Gareth, but how there is help there that is for every single one of us. So just for a few minutes, there's two things I want to get across that I hope will help us see the relevance of Gareth's story and of what he's discovered, and not just for Gareth. So the first thing to point out is that in the gospel, in the Bible, in what God is and what God has done, there are resources to help us cope with our struggles, with our trauma. So there are resources to help. One of the resources, and it's come out in the story, is that God is in control. Doesn't feel like anybody's in control, does it? But one of the big themes of the Bible is that God is in control. Now, that does create us some problems when we think about the sufferings in the world. And that's really a whole other evening. But I'll say one thing tonight, that, when we are suffering, it's really important that we don't push God away in the midst of that, because actually God is the only one who can understand, that really he's the only one who can actually help. So God's sovereignty, it creates some problems, but it also gives us hope, because it does mean that however chaotic our lives may feel, somebody is in control, and there is a plan. And though we don't see it or comprehend it yet, there is something. There is a mind behind it. There is a heart behind it. There is a purpose in it. So the world is not out of control, and though it may feel like it, your life is not out of control, and my life's not out of control. Now, that's important, I think, to know, and it's a powerful thing to realize. So there's loads of stuff we don't know about our lives, and there's loads of stuff we don't know about God, but we know that God is good. We know that God is good because he gave his Son to die for us, to reconcile us to him. So as we think about resources to help us, well, knowing that there is a God and knowing that God is in control, that can give you hope. It can give you some stability. It can give you some breathing space. But the other resource that can help us, not just that God is in control, but that God understands. It's very hard, isn't it, to find somebody who understands, who can be alongside us, and who doesn't say something stupid because they haven't quite grasped our situation, and somebody who is just full of empathy and compassion. Well, if the story of the Bible is true, then one of the big things we can say about God is that he does understand. And it's not that he understands because he's God and so he understands everything. You know, that's a type of understanding, isn't it? You might have an historian who knows everything about the D-Day landings because he's an historian. He's read all the books. He's looked at all the sources. And he can tell you in intimate detail everything that happened at the end of the Second World War, those D-Day landings. That's one kind of knowledge. And God does have that kind of knowledge. But he has another kind of knowledge. You know, somebody was actually there on D-Day. Somebody who went in on the first wave. They have a different kind of experience, don't they? They know what it's like on the inside. And if the story of the Bible is true, then what God has is not just the big picture knowledge. He has the knowledge of someone who's been there. Because at the heart of the Bible is the story of God coming down and taking our humanity and experiencing our struggles and our difficulties. So you look at the story of the life of Jesus. Jesus was an asylum seeker. His parents fled to Egypt when he was a baby. Jesus was homeless. He had nowhere to lay his head. Jesus was misunderstood. He was plotted against. He was betrayed. He was forsaken. He was falsely condemned. He suffered physically. He suffered emotionally. He suffered spiritually. And so I think it's enormously helpful to realize that God, he has tasted what we taste. And he has stood where we stand. He's experienced it all. And one of the greatest things in the Bible is where it tells us that he's moved with the feeling of our weakness. I think there's tremendous help there, tremendous resources there in our suffering, in our traumas. Not just to know God is sovereign, so there's hope, there's breathing space, but to know that he understands that he has walked our road and that he's felt our pain. So that's one thing. But there's a second thing I want to get across tonight. Not just these resources to help us cope, but more wonderfully than that, there is a solution for us to find. So when Jesus suffered, and he suffered terribly, the thing to understand is that he wasn't just suffering so he could sympathize with us. He wasn't just suffering so he could experience suffering. According to the Bible, he was suffering that he might end suffering. Not just to experience it, but to deal with it. So his death was not just an experience for him to experience what we will experience, so we have someone to turn to. But according to the Bible, his death was an atonement. He was taking our place. He was paying for our sins. Not only that, but his death was a victory. He was overcoming our enemies. because he was dealing with sin. He was defeating death itself. He was defeating Satan. He was overcoming all of that. And the proof is his resurrection. So when Jesus rises again the third day, there's something big happening there. It's not like a David Blaine moment, some sort of magic trick that's only relevant to him. It is a new beginning. He has overcome sin. He's overcome death. And so what the Bible does is presents the biggest imaginable hope, that God is making everything new. And in Jesus Christ, that is beginning, and it's available. And so that anyone, whoever we are, in our suffering or outside of our suffering, we can become part of that and experience that. And so the invitation of the Bible is to open up to that and to receive it, to move from whatever position of unbelief or atheism, however you want to dress it, and to begin to realize that we need him, and that he's big, and he's bigger even than death itself. So, to paraphrase Billy Graham, don't worry. I've read the last page of the Bible. Everything's going to be okay. Now that's the Christian message. Christ has done it. Nothing for us to contribute. He's done it. God has done it in Christ. If you've got him, you've got it all. Now, in the midst of trauma, very real trauma, there's hope there, there's help there, there's resources there, there's strength there, there's redemption there. So, we're really grateful to Gareth for coming all the way from Pembrokeshire, sharing as he shared. We're really grateful to Tony for putting him on the psychiatrist's couch and telling him things he didn't know about himself. And it's been a privilege to be here. So thank you for coming. Can I say, over on the table over there, if you've never really thought about the Bible, there are multiple copies there. Please help yourself. There are single Gospels, Mark's Gospel, John's Gospel. There are whole New Testaments, and there are whole Bibles. They're free. Please take literature on the way out as well. Some of it dealing with very real problems, whether that's anxiety. We try and keep that rack stocked, and we give those away to anybody who comes in. They can take them. It takes about a month for everything in that rack to disappear. That's why there's a lot of gaps. So we have to keep restocking it. But have a browse on the way out. Maybe there's something there that really speaks to where you are at. Okay, we're going to end. Please stick around as long as you like. Well, not quite as long as you like. We're going to bed eventually. But do not feel any pressure to leave immediately. There's more food at the back. We can get the kettle on again. So do please stick around and speak. So perhaps we could...